Calling all breath coaches, athletes, military, first responders, yogis, or anyone that wants to optimize their breathing practice. The reason you should care about today's discussion about the heart-breath relationship is because understanding how this works is like being given a master key to unlocking the peak efficiency for performance under any demand. That's including high-intensity exercise, altitude, and extreme stress. Hi, my name is Matt Soule, and this channel is where I cover the 5 fundamental stress tools that will propel you towards your best life. And the breath is one of those 5. In fact, it's what I call the stress tool modulator. VQ is the relationship between the heart and the breath. In my last video titled CO2, the 3 false myths, I talked about how sometimes the heart drives the breath rate, and at other times the breath rate drives the heart. So let's break this down. Imagine the actual pathway of air as it travels from a higher pressure in the atmosphere and enters into the relatively lower pressure of the lungs by first going through either the nose, the mouth, or both, then into the big upside down tree-looking structure that all of us have inside of our chests, composed of progressively smaller conducting tubes of our respiratory system, the trachea, the bronchi, and then the little bronchioles. And at the end of the bronchioles are small sacs called alveoli, which are the intermediary between the air of the lungs and the liquid blood of your vascular system. Now, this site of air meeting blood is where the first gas exchange occurs, and it's called external respiration. And the gases being exchanged are oxygen and carbon dioxide. Once this first exchange happens, oxygen is picked up and travels through blood inside of red blood cells that contain a protein called hemoglobin. Once those red blood cells reach your tissues, the hemoglobin drops off the oxygen there to enter your tissue cells and picks up the carbon dioxide that has been created by the cell. The site of this exchange is at the blood capillary, and it's called internal respiration. So let's take an example for external gas exchange to start. So remember that this is at the site of the alveoli, the interfacing site of where the air of the lungs meets the blood. So oxygen moves throughout the body in 2 ways, diffusion and perfusion. And what's the main difference between these? Well, the simplest way to think about each is that diffusion refers to gases, in other words, oxygen or carbon dioxide, and perfusion refers to liquids, blood in this case. And for gas exchange to be efficient and deliver what our bodies need, the right mixture of air and blood need to be available. So our bodies are set up in such a way that airflow and blood flow are regulated to try and coordinate to meet demand. Makes sense, right? Well, this relationship that I'm describing for this regulation is called VQ match, and the ratio our bodies steer toward is 0.8. Now let me show you how that 0.8 shows up. Well, the diffusion side of the coin is represented by V, which refers to ventilation, and it's the amount of air contributing to gas exchange. Let's just say as an estimate that while at rest, meaning during quiet, unforced breathing, this ventilation rate equals approximately 4,200 milliliters of air per minute. I got this figure by estimating that with each breath you captured 350 milliliters at roughly 12 breaths every minute. And Q describes perfusion, so referring in this case to cardiac output, which is a combination of the heart rate and how hard the heart contracts to pump blood through our system. The strength of contraction and blood output is also called stroke volume. Just so you're aware, you'll see that elsewhere. So simply defined, perfusion is the amount of blood flowing through the pulmonary capillaries each minute. So cardiac output at rest is roughly 5,000 milliliters per minute. So if we take the 4,200 milliliters of air and divide that by the 5,000 milliliters of blood, this will give us our 0.8, which describes the VQ relationship in the alveoli. Now, we all have different lung capacities, base breathing rates, and cardiac output, but since it is a relationship that steers toward 0.8, this is a general guideline that can adapt to the differences. Now, let's understand that the ratio is rarely perfect, especially as activity demand increases, but it always attempts to steer back toward this 0.8. But it's during this imbalance, right, where the heart rate or the breath rate will attempt to balance the other. For example, imagine your heart is beating relatively slowly and not contracting too hard. You're resting, but you start taking large breaths. Well, the heart will typically respond by speeding up and or beginning to pump harder to keep things in balance and remain efficient. By contrast, if you got frightened all of a sudden, your heart rate would spike triggering you to take a few or more breaths, preparing you for action that is likely to follow. Now, since our ability to consciously intervene is easiest and most accessible directly through the breath, it's here that we can make the biggest gains by focusing on rate and depth as demand varies. How do we do this? Well, essentially what we should be looking to establish is rhythm and proper muscle tension as we work to find the balance of the right amount of breathing. This will help the autoregulation processes in our bodies to tailor the right amount of vasoconstriction or dilation to feed the blood and the tissues through external and internal respiration processes. Now, there are several autoregulation processes that help us compensate for inefficiencies that surface. For example, in my last video, I mentioned that CO2 usually acts as a vasodilator, meaning the expanding of our vessels, which can help with perfusion. That's the blood flow. The way this works is that during exercise, cardiac output increases, oxygen demand increases, production of CO2 increases. As CO2 production increases and builds up in the alveoli, CO2 acts on the bronchiosmooth muscle to dilate and allow more oxygen to assist the increase in ventilation and oxygenation. Pretty cool. However, if you have reduced perfusion, it will limit the oxygen intake and CO2 exiting. And because there's no efficiency in this exchange, CO2 in this case will act upon the bronchiosmooth muscle to constrict and either redirect airflow to other alveoli or reduce ventilation. The above is one example of how our bodies will compensate under a variety of conditions to return to a normalized value of 0.8 for the VQ. Now, what would make perfusion decrease in a time when more blood is needed to remain efficient? Well, the biggest limitation, guys, as I mention often, is the heart. How so? Well, let me give you a quick example. The heart can remain efficient by finding a speed where it can sustain the ability to pump enough blood through the system, oxygenate the tissues, and help clear CO2 efficiently. But if too much CO2 is being produced at a rate that cannot be cleared fast enough, we start to get overloaded. The heart rate speeds up, the breath tries to match. As the heart rate speeds up higher and higher, the heart has less time to pick up enough oxygen, and each beat will pump less and less blood. Some adaptations that the vascular system makes are to try to tighten vessels in an attempt to pump what little blood is present in a faster and better manner. But this attempt to distribute what's available and help clear the CO2 is limited, right? It only lasts so long. Threshold becomes imminent. It's like having a hose with too little water coming through. If you could shrink the diameter of the hose just a bit, the little water you have will move better and faster through it, right? But as less and less water is actually coming through, you can only shrink the hose so small before you've nearly cut it off and it's not working. Expanding the hose doesn't help. You need more flow, and at a certain point, that can only happen by turning the valve up at the spigot higher. But if you can't do that, you're at a loss. The spigot is the heart in this analogy. So to reiterate, if the heart can't pump more at a rate needed, the body's vascular tubes can only compensate so much by squeezing or widening to accommodate where it's all needed. We have one spigot, in other words, one heart, but thousands upon thousands of miles of little hoses that need to be squeezed or widened to accommodate the supply of blood available. This is one reason why you can even see relatively high oxygen saturation in the blood while still hitting oxygen deficit in the tissues. Perfusion is not happening at a rate and supply that feeds the working tissues. And again, opening those vessels wider won't help in this case. It will only disrupt the overall blood pressure. Another way that we can be inefficient is with a disrupted breathing pattern, as mentioned in part of this breathing series in former videos. What quickly happens is that blood pressure spikes to try to capture what little oxygen is entering, but since there's too little, this leaves a person breathless. This disrupted breathing can happen at the beginning of the exercise for the unaware, or is also common late in a training session when overall fatigue sets in and we become tired. Another common error, especially as intensity increases, is overusing muscles which will require more blood flow, more oxygen, and more overall breathing, which can quickly tire the diaphragm, intercostals, accessory breathing muscles, and of course, add a load to the heart. So to learn how to be the most efficient, you need rhythm, flow, proper resistance, tailored by how we breathe, as well as vascular and muscle strength. Concentrating on these variables will help optimize the autoregulation processes of your body. Bottom line, gas diffusion is a passive process based on relative constituents in the system. Perfusion is limited by flow and concentration of blood. The limitations are improved or exacerbated by the strength of the heart, the available oxygen, the demand of the tissues, and the narrowing or relaxing of the vascular network to create blood pressure sufficient to shuttle oxygen to the tissues and clear out CO2. Proper coordination and good efficiency will drive these factors. If you really want peak efficiency though, understand that ideally you want the system to hum in a rhythmic way. You don't want unnecessary muscles to be overusing energy, causing the system to have to feed those at the expense of other muscles working. You also want to work less where possible. You want to remain calm to the extent appropriate for the situation. Ramping your heart way up can speed the breath up and vice versa to the point that it's inefficient, a downward spiral, especially as we get things like adrenaline and noradrenaline working to reroute blood in the process. Be sure to stay tuned for future videos where I will lay down very specific exercises to anchor this theory into practice. If you like this video, guys, give it a thumbs up and subscribe so that you can catch all of my latest content. And be sure to check out the other videos in this series on breathing so that you can become a master of breath and lead to your own peak performance. Until next time, breathe rhythmically.